Atamari e koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tēnā koe, Mr. Malloy. Sorry, your microphone wasn't on. Perhaps you could repeat that.
Indeed, ma'am. We have three witnesses this morning. Ms. Joychild will be taking you through the evidence of the first.
Thank you, Mr. Malloy. Tēnā koe, Ms. Joychild.
The evidence I'm reading today is of Kiwibank, who is a survivor of Lake Alice and who is living in Australia and did not feel able to read his evidence.
May I ask, is he going to be watching this evidence today?
Yes, he is. He may watch it afterwards,
yes,
or live.
Well, if he's watching either now or later, we'd just like to send him our warmest greetings and thank him for providing the evidence and wish him well while he's listening to it.
Thank you, ma'am. He'll appreciate that. Just as an overview at the beginning, I thought it might be helpful to tell Commissioners Kevin was 14 years old when he was first admitted. He was one of the longer ones there. He was there for 1 year, 11 months, and he went in March 1973. So he was one of the early ones into the unit as well.
Before the adolescent unit was started?
After it. Yes, I think so.
All right.
So, because he's not here, I'll just read through it.
All right. And can I just ask you to
yes,
be very mindful of our signers, please.
Sure. So, I was born 62 years ago. Now I live in Australia with my wife. We have 2 sons and have been together for 30 years. I also have 2 older daughters from previous relationships. I receive a disability support pension and have not been in the workforce since 1993. I spent just over 24 months in Lake Alice under Dr. Selwyn Leeks when I was between the ages, and I apologise, I've just said 1 year, 11. Probably it's to do with counting months and weeks,
yes,
but the exact dates are there. When I was between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. I had 3 admissions, 21 March 73 to 24 April 73, 9 July 73 to 27 August 73, and 20 February 74 to 10 December 75. In between my second and third admission, I spent 2 months at Ipuni Boys Home. That was hell, but Lake Alice was much worse. I never had a mental illness before or during my time at Lake Alice. The only mental conditions I now have are a result of my time in Lake Alice and Ipuni. I suffer from memory loss, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. These conditions, plus chronic fear of failure and not being good enough, have haunted me ever since I left Lake Alice. They created continuing problems for me in holding a job until I could no longer be in the workforce. They have ruined my quality of life. I've always tried to get justice for those of us who had the misfortune to be in Lake Alice while Dr. Selwyn Leeks was in charge. Basically, our lives and potential were destroyed in that place. I was broken by what Dr. Leeks and other staff did to me, and as I have grown older, the impacts have got worse, not better. It is a deep grievance of mine that Dr. Leeks was never brought to justice in a criminal trial. Now, Kevin was one of the earliest ones to complain about Lake Alice, and so he's made a number of statements, and I've set them all out on page 2. So there's a great deal of his band. I was very close to my granddad and spent a lot of time with him. As an older child, I spent most of my time practicing snare drum rudiments and playing with a Palmerston North band as their drummer. This was my huge passion. And then as a schoolboy, I worked at 5:30 a.m. cleaning windows before school. After school, I had a paper run delivering newspapers in the local area. In short, my life was full during my youth. But when I was about 12, my mother developed breast cancer, which caused a great deal of stress and problems within the family unit. As I grew older, the tensions in the house increased. I would stand up to my stepfather. I acknowledge I got caught in the wrong crowd, but not to the extent it led to any arrest or police attention. It got to the point where it was either I leave home or my stepfather would. I recall an incident when a physical fight broke out between us. After that fight, a social worker was brought in. For a year or so, I saw her on a weekly basis. But after another fighting incident with my stepfather, I was told that I'd be going to stay at the Mariner Boys' Home in Palmerston North. That never eventuated as the home was full. What happened was that one day I arrived home from school to see my mother packing a suitcase with my clothes and telling me I was going away for a while. I had thought it was to stay with a relative and was quite happy. However, instead of taking me to an auntie, Mum took me to Lake Alice. This was the first of 3 stays. I was there for 5 weeks the first time, 6.5 the second, and 1 year, 10 months for the third. It was my social worker from the Department of Social Welfare who arranged with Dr. Leeks for me to be admitted to Lake Alice on each occasion. So here we have a situation where, although he wasn't a state ward, social welfare placed him there. On the third occasion, I was taken there by the police, and he's already said he never had any mental illness. I told my social worker whenever she saw me that I was being abused and shocked. She never did anything about it. And for the commissioners, his medical certificates say that he had antisocial behaviour tendencies, and later in one, Dr. Leeks talked about an adolescent schizophrenia process. Between the second and third stay in Lake Alice, I was sent to Ipuni Boys' Home for 2 months. I was sexually abused by a staff member. He was a predator. I was physically and psychologically abused by the PE teacher. He was so violent, he knocked me out on several occasions. And details of the abuse are in one of his exhibits in a statement of claim. So on Kevin's first day of admission, when he got out of the car, he says, I was grabbed by 2 male nurses. My mother walked as far as the office but was cut off there. I was walked into villas, and a short time later I was taken upstairs by 3 staff nurses, Johnny Blackmore and either Steve Hunt or Terry Conlon. Dr. Leeks was there, and he explained what the, quote, shock box was and how it worked. He then gave me my first ECT. There was no anaesthetic and the male nurses held me down while it was being given. On my second and third admissions, I also had no meeting or assessment. I was just taken straight into the villa. So he was put into the adolescent ward here, Villa 11. And then he went into, on his final stays, he went into Villa 15, 13 and finally 8, where he remained till he left. And from Villa 8, Kevin was sent to maximum security for 2 weeks and then back to Villa 8. So Kevin has described his ECT experiences in several earlier statements. He estimated for the Minter Ellison affidavit, and that was one sought by the Victorian Medical Board, who were going to prosecute Dr. Leeks in 2006. In that, he said he thought he would have, over his 3 stays, have been electrocuted about 60 to 70 times to his head, both modified and unmodified, about once or twice a week to his legs and arms on a good week, half a dozen times on a bad week, half a dozen times all up to his genitals, and a couple of times for asthma. Yes, we'll put up exhibit number 008. No, he's changed his mind at the last minute. This just shows that this shows the dates up to the present time, it says, where he received ECTs.
Could you just tell us what the document is, please?
Now, these are the nursing notes.
Right. So they weren't, this is not notes made
Well-
subsequently, are they contemporaneous notes, do you know?
They are contemporaneous notes. In fact, Mum, they were made in a report, I'm just remembering, on one of his readmissions when they had to report on him. So to that, and Kevin says that he was given way more ECT than that. But there is some records, and we think that they're the modified ones. Okay, so at paragraph 16, he says, I also can't put the pain of unmodified ECT into words. Nothing compares with the intensity of the pain. Dr. Leeks would start on low and then turn the dial to high. On low, it was like little sledgehammers hitting my head, and they got bigger sledgehammers as the dial turned up. On high, the pain was like razor blades cutting through my head. The head was worse for pain than the arms and legs, though getting it on them was still enough to absolutely stun you. ECT on the genitals was horrific, like hot needles going into your testicles. I still have sensations of the same pain in the areas I got ECT. And he says, apart from about 6 times, I always had ECT without anaesthetic. Most was in my first year there. The unmodified day was usually a Friday, and staff called it Black Friday. Unmodified ECT was for punishment. You got it if your name was in Dr. Leeks's, quote, blue diary. And it was the staff that would put you down for this during the week. You could get it for very small transgressions, such as talking back to staff, smoking cigarette butts, running down the road. I got it mostly for smoking, being cheeky to staff, and being rough and tough with other boys. I would wet my bed with fear on Thursday nights because I was so petrified of ECT. On the Friday morning, the boys would all be gathered in the day room, waiting in fear to see if they were going to be called up for ECT. Staff would randomly single out 3 boys to get ECT ready for when Dr. Leeks would arrive. One would have to take a small table upstairs for the shock box to sit on. One would carry the shock box, and one would be sent to the kitchen to fill the steel bowl with water and bring that plus the rubber gag that went into the mouth upstairs. Then the boys would be sent back to the day room and wait to see if they would be called up for ECT. The whole room, even the big tough boys, were in terror, and many would be crying in fear. Sometimes Dr. Leeks himself would come into the day room and say, "Who's for the zap?" Or "Who's for the ride on the Thunderbolt?" Or "Who's for the national grid?" And we heard yesterday Tyrone referring to the national grid. That was a term of Dr. Leeks. When Dr. Leeks performed his ECT sessions, the doors were left open upstairs and downstairs. In the day room, the boys could hear the screaming and cries of pain from those who were getting it. Villa 11 was a boys-only unit. I recall some of the boys urinating in fear when they were pointed out as ones that were going to have a ECT next. We could also see the ones who had ECT coming out of the room. Just seeing them was terrifying. Some had water drizzling down their temples, some had blood coming out of their mouths, and all of them were dazed. Sometimes they had to be carried downstairs, and sometimes they were unconscious. There were children aged 5 and 6 who received ECT, with and without the anaesthetic. I recall seeing ECT administered when I was on a cleaning duty to a boy who was aged 9. I saw the marks on his temples after he had it and heard his screams. Sexual assault. Once I woke up from ECT to find another boy bathing me and fondling my genitals. We were often taken to the bathroom state after because we had soiled ourselves. ECT took away control of our bowels and bladder, and we often vomited. I would regularly wake up in one of the cell rooms after ECT, or if I was conscious, I'd be led downstairs back to the day room with the other boys. ECT for asthma. I was given unmodified ECT on my left shoulder by Dr. Leeks at least twice. I'd had an asthma attack the day before. Before it started, he said, "We'll see if this stops your asthma." After that, I never went to the office for my inhaler during an asthma attack, as I was terrified what would happen the next day. So clearly a staff member had told Dr. Leeks that he had had an asthma attack. The intensity of the shock through the electrodes. Sometimes a nurse would sit right on my body to prevent my body convulsing too much. ECT when tied together with another boy. Once me and another boy were caught smoking by a nurse. He smelled our breath. He strapped our arms crosswise to each other by a trouser belt and placed the electrodes on each of our arms, and Dr. Leeks gave us a shock. He played the dial for about 30 seconds. Staff giving ECT when Dr. Leeks was not present. Sometimes the staff gave us unmodified ECT without Dr. Leeks. They seemed to enjoy doing this, and I recall one doing it to me, going from one knee to the other with the electrodes, also on the legs and arms. This was in the medical room next to the kitchen. ECT to the genitals. I got this if I was caught playing with myself. Dr. Leeks always gave these treatments. He would start by putting the electrode on my thigh and then slide it up my leg to my testicles. Yet I never interfered with other boys, as I've never been homosexual. Modified ECT. This was better than unmodified ECT because I was anaesthetised and completely unconscious. It was performed in the females' villa. You knew you would get it because the kitchen staff would not give you breakfast that morning. You would then be taken over to Villa 6 and put into a cubicle and made to lie on the bed. The staff would take your shoes and socks off and roll up your sleeve and give you an injection. However, on several occasions the staff didn't give me an injection. So the electrodes were put straight onto my head without anaesthetic. Villa 6 had cubicles which accommodated one patient each. I recall walking into the wing of the unit where ECT was being administered once. I witnessed people of all ages receiving or about to receive ECT. And then giving ECT to other boys. Dr. Leeks got me and other boys to give ECT to 2 different boys on different occasions. Both had sexually assaulted me and the other boys. The first time was to a particular boy. I recall Dr. Leeks calling about 10 of us into the day room one day to find out if we had been sexually touched by this boy. I had been sexually abused by him and another patient, and I informed Dr. Leeks about it. Without any other explanation, some of us were tasked with getting the ECT machine and the bowl and salt water and gags. We then were sent back to the day room of Villa 11, all petrified that we were going to get ECT. Soon after, Dr. Leeks came into the room and told us to follow him. We went to a cell, a solitary cell at the far right of Villa 8. It was almost completely dark, and I remember seeing that particular boy sitting in the corner on a plastic mattress, wearing only his underwear. Dr. Leeks asked us to plug in the extension cord and said we were all going to use the ECT machine on that particular boy. He told us we were to move the knob to the right as far as possible. I was second or third in line, and there were a number of boys behind me. I didn't really want to do it, but I remember that I did turn the dial as far as I could, as I was afraid that if I didn't do it properly, Dr. Leeks would give me ECT. I recall the horror on the boy's face who was receiving it. He looked like he was screaming, but not a sound was coming out of his mouth. After we had all given him ECT, Dr. Leeks put the electrodes onto his testicles and pushed the silver instant button, which gives a really sudden shock. When he did this, the particular boy went unconscious. On another occasion, Dr. Leeks lined us up to do the same to another boy who had also been sexually touching some of the boys. He finished that session by placing the electrode on his temples and using the knockout button. Giving ECT to those 2 other boys made me feel very sad. On the one side, I liked it because they had abused me, but on the other side, I felt really bad for doing it. Now moving on to drugs. Paraldehyde injections. Sometimes I was given a choice of ECT or paraldehyde for punishment. Both were used to control us and keep us in fear. The worst punishment was unmodified ECT, but paraldehyde injections were also a feared punishment. You could get a paraldehyde injection for anything at all, such as talking back to staff, hitting another boy, not making your bed properly, or not getting up on time. They were extremely painful. I believe I would have got a paraldehyde injection more than 50 times over my 3 admissions to Lake Alice. That's a bare minimum, I guess. When the injection first went in, it was a very cold feeling, but then the feeling turned to very hot, burning acid. The injection would normally be put into the buttocks and the pain would go down the whole leg. It would be very painful, very hard to walk. The leg would feel dead and I would have no strength in it. It was painful to sit down for about 3 days. When I had it in my arm, it would hang limp for the day. Once I was given it on the shoulder and on several occasions in the big muscle above my knees. This was particularly painful to have it, and the staff were aware of this. Formaldehyde had a foul smell and would leave a sickening taste in my mouth for 3 days after. I was on other medication nearly all the time I was at Lake Alice. I got Malaril, Largactil, Pantacol, Stelazine, Priadel, Modicit, to name a few. I remember dribbling and stumbling. The drugs completely changed me. Sexual abuse. I was a blonde, blue-eyed boy, and this wasn't an advantage. I got a lot of unwanted sexual attention. There was a staff member called John Blackmore. Sometimes when he was meant to be giving me a formaldehyde injection, he sexually abused me instead. I believe he also abused other boys this way. While formaldehyde was usually done with the door open so other patients could hear, he would close and lock it when it was me. And this was justified with the excuse that I might run away. You had to take your pants down to get a formaldehyde injection in the buttocks. He would take his own pants down and then he would either sodomise me or masturbate me and himself at the same time. He did this often. The school teacher at the time would walk around and sometimes press his groin into my back and I would feel he had an erection. He would leave the classroom with a particular boy and then take him out to the toilets. At times I was one he asked to leave the room with. He would make me pull down my pants and he'd pull down his. I had to go onto hands and knees on the floor and then he would masturbate himself from behind me. He never raped me, but he did touch and push against me. He would threaten me with the thunderbolt from Dr. Lex if I told. I understand he's now been convicted of sexual abuse. We were also sexual prey for older boys, and there were 2 boys who were older and bigger and competed with us, each other, to get to us. And they were the 2 boys that he gave electric shocks to. Lots of us boys were targeted. One of those particular boys abused me regularly in the showers. In other aspects of life at Lake Alice. Schooling. I went to school while I was in Villa 11 for half a day, several days a week. I think this was when they'd finally got a school set up there. It looked nothing like a real school. I recall learning a lot of songs and sometimes doing reading. I did not have any correspondence education. I did, however, play drums with a couple of the patients who were also musical. Each year there was a staff reunion, and on one occasion my mother's band performed for the staff and I played percussion for that. My mother visited me a couple of times and my social worker also visited. I always complained to them about what was happening to me. My mother never believed it and my stepfather called me a liar. The social worker never took action. Staff. I was constantly told by staff that I was bad and they were going to drum it out of me. I was also told that I would be there for life. Some nurses were sadistic and they participated in the torture of us. Some beat up patients, including me, and some sexually abused patients, including me. There was one nurse called Dennis Hesseltine. He was the only person I felt safe with. He was a very nice person, funny, young, and had a beard. He was the type of person I would have liked my father to be like. Even he, however, was part of the torture, as he never spoke up about it or tried to stop it. Villa 8. In Villa 8, I was with adults with serious mental problems. We called it the nut house. I was 15. It was a very frightening and scary place. There were always patients prowling around wanting to have their way with you. I had to learn quickly how to keep other patients off me, but without injuring them. As if I did, I got a formaldehyde injection for punishment. I often stayed awake at night, lying scared in my bed with the blankets tightly tucked in to protect myself. ECT in Villa 8 was always unmodified. I witnessed it on occasions. It was used on people like those two boys who engaged in sexual abuse. I never got it, but I would hear it being given to the others who were screaming in pain and fear. I got paraldehyde injections in Villa 8. On one occasion, when I was in Villa 8, I was locked in maximum security for 2 weeks. This was located at the rear of the hospital for the criminally insane. The reason I was sent there was that I had refused staff member Howard Lawrence's order that I clear the toilets with the toothbrush. I was allowed out into a tiny exercise yard for 30 minutes every 24 hours. I was given a few books, but otherwise there was nothing apart from a mattress, blanket and bucket. Lawrence was a particularly evil guy who used to push his knuckles into our temples and ask, "Do you bum, boy?" Work in Villa 8. I was part of a gang doing labouring from 9 to 4. We earned $1 a week. I had no education when I was in Villa 8. I had to bathe elderly patients who were too old to wash themselves. I had to wash people's clothes and the dishcloths, etc. One day a nurse, and he gives the name, gave another boy and I the task of carrying a person on a stretcher. We had to be very quiet and carry him very carefully to a particular destination. On the way, the sheet blew up and I saw a tag on his big toe and realised he was dead. Later, I looked at his face. He was an older patient who had died. I was very disturbed as I'd never been around a dead body before. When I got back, that nurse was laughing and thought it was a great joke we hadn't known the person had died. It impressed upon me human life was of very little value at Lake Alice. Mum, I realise I've done 30 minutes, so time is tight because I've been talking slowly. I think I'll just pick and choose from here on.
Yes, full in the knowledge, as I said before, that we have it and have read it, and of course we'll read it again carefully after. So you just choose the matters. We're getting on to impacts, aren't we?
Yes, well, we're just quickly going through life after Lake Alice. It's important, he was just Kevin, at 48, he says he was drove down by a nurse, never told that he was getting out of Lake Alice. He thought they were actually transporting him to Porirua Hospital, but when he drove past the exit, he realised he wasn't. Then the nurse told him he was going to the Woburn YMCA and that he was going to do a labouring job in a factory at Petone. And he was 16 years then, he'd be 17 the following month. So when Kevin left Lake Alice, suddenly all his drugs stopped, every single one. And in his exhibits, you'll see he's cleared. He's got no mental problems at all. Rather than feeling dopey, he was full of nervous energy, and after a highly regimented regime, being woken to a siren, having all your movements organised, suddenly this was this kid living alone in the YMCA and having to get to work on time every day. He had real problems getting out of bed, and he thinks that was the result of a reaction to withdrawal from drugs and problems managing buses. Everyone knew he'd been in Lake Alice and made fun of him. Eventually he was dismissed for lateness. But he had various other jobs after that, and he developed a pattern that dogged him. He could manage the work well, often got promoted as he presented well. And I'm pointing out a comment from the Director of Mental Health when he first complained in 1977. The Director called him in for an interview about his complaint, and the Director wrote, "Kevin is well-dressed, well-spoken young man. He had employed as a salesman, playing regularly in a military band, living in a house which he has rented himself with 3 friends, apparently well on his way to establishing himself." And Kevin was. He played in military bands and police bands in Wellington, but eventually it all caught up with him. So he talks about being interviewed for petty theft, and he left New Zealand. He was so terrified of being taken back to Lake Alice. He moved to England, Australia, and then to England. He met his first wife, brought her back to New Zealand. She opened a letter and read that the statement from CCHR, his first affidavit that he wrote, and then of course she didn't trust him. She didn't trust him sexually, and she thought that she'd married someone with mental health problems. So that relationship broke up. It was very bitter and difficult because of his history that was played against him in the family court, but he did get access to his child. At paragraph 61, he talks about Victor Boyd coming to his house and him making a complaint. He went to the police and made a statement to the police at that time. He notes that he signed it without reading it. Some of the things in it are not quite accurate, but mostly it is. Then he went to, he didn't know he could have the right to read it. He was just told sign. Then he had the interview with the Director General of Health. I thought that was Dr. Merriam's. Anyway, it's on the record. He said he would attend, I think this was the Mitchell inquiry, he said he would go to it, but only if he didn't have to see Dr. Leeks. Yes, that's fine. So while he's there, Dr. Leeks is brought into the room with two men in suits on either side. And Dr. Leeks actually spoke to him, and this is what he said in 1977. Not everything I did at Lake Alice was 100% right or correct. He said he gave the Maori boys more ECT as he had to control the boys he took on from Koiteri Boys Home. And Kevin was not allowed to tell his story. He was asked just a few very pointed questions. And after that, they had not let him just talk, but were only focusing on a few points. And Dr. Leeks coming in without his notice, he lost all faith in the inquiry. And Dr. Leeks, then when a medical association asked Dr. Leeks to respond to the complaint, Dr. Leeks wrote a very malicious letter about Kevin, and it's set out there, where he tried to paint Kevin in the worst possible light and made up that he had a mental illness. Kevin admits he was not an angel and got into bad company, but he never had disoriented thinking. And that's confirmed by medical treatment since then. Importantly, 6 years later, and this is part of that Stockholm syndrome, he got very depressed with his marriage breaking up. He actually rang everyone all around the world trying to find Selwyn Leeks. He became obsessed with him, found that he was working in the same city as he was living in Melbourne. He went and visited Selwyn Leeks, and he also wanted treatment for his depression. And then at paragraph 70, Selwyn Leeks commented, "Your name's familiar. Do you?" And Kevin says, "Do you remember me?" Selwyn Leeks said, "I remember that you were going through a hard time and that your stepfather was a fairly unsavoury fellow." And Kevin said, "Why did you torture us?" And at 71, Dr. Leeks said, "I had an open hand to do what I could do." Kevin asked, "Why did you make me give ECT to the other boys?" And Dr. Leeks said that was quite legal in some parts of the States. Later, Dr. Leeks said, "I'll never do what I've done or most of what I'd done again," and Kevin felt he was remorseful. He spoke quietly and looked at the ground. Part of Kevin wanted to hit him, but he seemed so quiet and gentle it made Kevin feel like submitting to him. Yet it was all going through Kevin's head that the other side of him had inflicted horrendous pain on me and others while seeming so cool. Kevin felt Dr. Leeks has a mesmerising hold over him, and he actually went to him for about 6 sessions before he realised he was just a puny little man and my terror of him had gone.
Just, I know it's hard.
Yes.
Please.
So Kevin also worked with the media, Grant Cameron's class action, and with the Victorian Medical Board. And at paragraph 71, he talks about the impacts on his life. And they include memory loss, chronic pain and migraines.
77, I think.
77.
Yes.
Incessant fears, terrors, nightmares. He has anal bleeding and he suffers. It's so excruciating, it reduces him to tears, and he cannot sit upright properly. And that brings back the memories and horror and emotions from sexual abuse at Lake Alice. He's huge problems with trust and feelings of betrayal, and all those he's worked with to prepare his case, he has ended up feeling betrayed by or let down, and he explains those circumstances there. Then Kevin says what he wants from the Royal Commission. This is at paragraph 88. I want the Royal Commission to delve fully and properly into what happened at Lake Alice, to hear our voices and to make findings about what happened to us there. We need to be validated for the hell we went through and the hell we live with since. I want it to explain why we have waited this long. I want the police to charge Dr. Leeks even if he is over 90. He showed no sympathy for us and our vulnerability, and he's had the benefit of a good, free life ever since he left Lake Alice. I want the government to pay proper compensation to me for the loss of my potential to earn an income, be happy and have a good life. I want repayment of Grant Cameron's legal fees. And I want there to be a legal representative for every child and young person in care to make sure their side of the story is told and always recorded in official notes. One of the matters that has distressed Kevin the most is the really degrading, horrible comments made about him in the notes, like he's sly and manipulative. And he never, records of incidents that are wrong, but he never had the chance to have his story about what happened put on those notes. I want ongoing support to my family as well as me for the trauma we have all lived with as a result of me being tortured in Lake Alice. And there's a lot of extra material in Kevin's exhibits, Mum. That's his story.
Which we're grateful to you for recounting, and I'm sorry that you felt constrained by the time, but it's come through. Just
That's
a
fine.
point of clarification and for the record, because this is an important part of the common story of the survivors. He did receive compensation after going through what was called the Grant Cameron action, but he paid a considerable proportion of that back in legal fees.
Yes.
Or he lost a considerable proportion.
Yes, and that's
that's what he's seeking for. I wanted to make sure that that was the case.
Yes.
Yeah.
But like the others, because there was no accountability, Leeks was still running around and no one told them why it had happened. He never could put it to rest.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm just going to ask Cassandra Lofivai to formally thank Kevin for his evidence.
Kevin, I'm hoping that you've been able to watch the proceedings this morning, and if you haven't, that you will be able at some time later on to be able to access it. I want to thank your counsel, Ms. Joychild, for reading it in such a way and for highlighting the points that clearly are very, very important, salient, that you want us to absolutely take note of. Kevin, I just want to reassure you we have read your material and everything else that you've submitted to the Commission. I want to thank you for your honesty and your bravery like the other survivors that have gone on before you this week. There is such power in your words, and the common themes and the parallels and the descriptions are now embedded, or said actually, in our own minds and our brains. Kevin, we believe you and we accept everything that you've said. I'm grateful that you've been able to find some peace and have been able to move on in some respect. But we're also very, very grateful, Kevin, that you've been able to outline very clearly for us what you'd like to see this Royal Commission achieve on behalf of all of the Lake Alice survivors. It's certainly our intent to be able to make findings and recommendations that will go a long way, hopefully to be able to answer and put this Lake Alice part of our history and our nation to rest. So can I just thank you, Kevin, once again for the great and the generous aroha that you have for our nation of Aotearoa, to be able to speak into this space so powerfully and to speak up for those who can't come forward because they're no longer with us, and for those who aren't able to come forward because they don't have the strength. So thank you for being their courage and for being their friend.
Thank you.